I was born in Urumqi, Xinjiang, which is one of the biggest provinces of China. I have to describe that the beauty of the land and the waters and the little lakes surrounding is absolutely gorgeous. It was a beautiful place which I suppose today does not exist. And it all began because my grandfather came from Russia in His Majesty's service, and unfortunately after revolution remained there. Somehow the madness of the communist era began when I was only 2 years of age. One night my mother was sitting and sewing because she was a perfect seamster, and my grandfather has arrived. The rest and the madness of the communist regime already began much more advanced than it was before. And when my grandfather came in, he said to my mother, "I came here just to tell you that I have a feeling that something dreadful, something absolutely destructive will happen in this land." And after talking to my mother, he went to my bedroom, where my sister was also a child. She was just being born. He took me on his lap, came back to my mother and said, "With all the madness, this is the only child that will save whatever will be left over from the Dubrovskis family." And that's how began the Xinjiang life. 2 years later, of course, my father was the second husband of my mother. Before that, she was married to Count Poltavsky, and she was only 15 years of age when she married him. During her time, she realized that the Count was somehow, the behavior of his nature became very, very different from the original behavior when he married her. She bore him several children. I had a first sister or stepsister, and I had 3 brothers, but unfortunately all the children of my mother have died. And while I was in prison camp, have buried my sister. She was 18 years of age, or 16, I don't remember. I think she was 16. And that was another area later, many years later, actually about 7 or 8 years later, when that burial has happened. So my mother decided to find out what is actually her husband, that's mean the first husband, was doing. She tiptoed to his office at night. He always used to go and only work at night, never during the daytime. And behind his back she stood and she decided to find out all the details, what was going on. And for her awful dismay and shock, she discovered that the list of all the people, especially those who were against the communist era and a communist judgment and a communist Soviet Union regime, he put everything in writing, and which was sent to Russia, and I believe it was actually Moscow that has been sent into it to identify all the so-called against the communism regime Russian, as they used to call the White Russians, and should be exterminated, including the Tartars, the Mongols, Shibins, and Chinese, who also were against the Russian regime. So she walked away, and that's where beginning the sort of a divorce at the same time, and yet the most important was how to save the family and the rest of the people that she knew, or the relatives. As I was mentioned, my grandfather had 18 children, however, 9 only survived. By the time the arrest and the execution and the prison camps and everything began, so only 9 children were survivable. My father, my grandfather, was taken to a different prison camp, which they called the torturous prison camps. So some of the men, like my uncles, 2 uncles, were taken to a different younger, so-called the younger, because what they decided that perhaps those still can be rehabilitated and made like a Soviet agents or something if they will obey the orders. But the women and the children were sent to a different camp. So it was 3 different camps at that time, and everyone went to the different sections. The city Kure, which we call it the City of the Dead or City of the Dead Valley, was specifically being arranged, including like Hitler used to have the Auschwitz in order to exterminate the Jews. They were preparing this, just put it and gassed the people to make it easier and faster sort of a execution. So we arrived to Kure, and I still remember very well, there was a big, huge room to which about all the women and children being tucked in. There were no beds, there were nothing, there were no chairs. All we had was the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. And I still remember also, as a matter of fact, there were 2 little windows on the top, so whatever lights that we were getting through it, that's what we had. When we have arrived there, the whole situation is impossible to explain. However, I also do remember there was a lot of tears and sickness and despair in the people's attitude, and whatever they were trying to do just to make easier, because the people who were actually the guards who were looking at the whole people, trying to put them in those little rooms of barracks, were so brutal, and the screams were brutal as well. That I still can remember, although I was about 2 years of age. So when we came into this room, and there was about at least 30, 40 people, I dream, could have been, all but my mother finally found a little spot on the corner, and she managed to put her little sister there and us with my grandmother. So we said that in that prison camp, under those conditions, we existed for about 2.5 years. I believe it was almost 2.5 years before there was an escape being arranged to go to Kulja, which is about maybe 250 or 300 kilometers from Kure to Kulja. And during our stay, many people died because, first of all, the children, the sickness like the smallpox was taken, including the typhus that was raging, because of the condition on sort of without any water practically, without any hygiene. So basically the children were the first victims, and as well as many other, the adults. So the original man who was in charge of that prison camp was a Chinaman. Finally, he was somehow I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think a year later, or almost 2 years, he was substituted by a Mongol, who happened to be that he used to be at my father's dinners in Urumqi in good old times. And of course, he recognized the Dubrovski's family and tried to make it without too much scene, but trying to alleviate the madness of this existence. As a matter of fact, I still now remember one thing, that when he saw my grandmother and mother, and because there was a lot of respect for my mother, at least my mother was telling me he used to bring some food without any, so that people won't realize, but into our room where all the 30 or 35 people, women and children, he used to feed us. That I remember very well. Well, 2.5 years of madness went on, and we managed to escape from Kulja, from Kure to Kulja. And after 2.5 years, he decided that the best way to save whatever is possible to save the people from here, because not only us, I'm sure he knew many others as well. At night, he decided to get some trucks, put whatever possible into the trucks, the children and the women, because there were no men. Actually, that's all were exterminated or prison camps around the world. He put us on the trucks and decided to take us to Kulja, which is about 300 miles or 350 kilometers, kilometers from Kure. So in a way, we were safe for a certain amount of time, because the most of the people who left behind, they were exterminated. And as I mentioned before, and I mention again, that the so-called chambers, the gas chambers, has been built in Kure. Upon our arrival to Kudra, actually, that was another episode of life which becomes, whether it's difficult or not, but I think it's the era which is much more lonely and much more profoundly affected my own self as well as my sister. It's because that where begins the separation from me, from my mother, and the loneliness until I became 12 years of age, and we were saved later by another Tartar prince to go back to Urumqi. Upon arrival, the people were sort of distribution happened. Women were taken to one prison. The children at 5 years, until 5 years, were taken to the children's commune. And of course, the only about 2 years children were whichever they were safe with the parents. So they were divided into 3 categories. During those years, I spent exactly almost 6-7 years before I was able to see my mother again. The survival was simply zero because children, especially at my age, were dying left and right, to be honest with you. One of the things that I do remember is also because among all the people in the world, I had a very dear, lovely friend. Her name was Rukuya, and we were the same age actually. And I do remember that there were no dolls, no nothing. We never seen anything like that. But somehow she discovered a little doll. And that little doll, which was made out of a purchase of material, was very, very small. But she made it so secretive that only she and I knew about this doll. So at night, at the dark, when everything was darkened, we would go in the corner and imagine some beautiful, interesting little things in the world from this madness of the day. But I think the life in itself was very, very difficult for a very simple reason, because first of all, we had no food. The best we were given was 1 or 2 pieces of black bread, which thank God in a way was good because it was full of vitamins and survival pattern. And at night, whenever there's so-called the soup, which was made out of water and a little bit of potato, maybe a little carrot of this, that was our so-called survival of foods. The children of my age, we were all sentenced sort of to a hard labor. The hard labor consisted of cleaning the houses, cleaning the cells, bringing the coal, bringing the big huge of firewoods. I remember still that. But mine has been somehow, I was one of the biggest among all the children, so I was told that I was supposed to bring every morning and every afternoon 2 buckets of water, which I had to walk to the river. It's about at least maybe 2 miles away from the compound that we were in. And one of those days, of course, I went to bring the water. It was during the winter time, I remember very well. In Urumqi, the winters are just like a Siberian winters. It's about 42 degrees or even up, but 42 was a normal winter time. Of course, the river used to be all full of ice, and they had to make holes in order to get the water out of the river for drinking. So here I go. I was about 5 or 6, almost 6 years of age. And I had 2 buckets, and I tried with the first bucket. I managed, of course, to pull it out and put it in, and I had to get the second bucket. So when I got the second bucket, I lost the strength to pull it up, the bucket up with the water, and try to hold myself against the line. Almost half of my body actually was already inside of the hole, which is the water hole, if I can call it. It is at that moment, actually, I felt that somebody got my legs and was pulling me out of that hole. And by the time I was put it back and stood up, the first bucket, of course, I lost, but the second bucket I managed to sustain. It was an older man, and I still remember his kind eyes. He was very, very tall, and all what he did, he'd pull me up and he says, Kızımka, which is the Tartar name for the child or a little girl. He said, you should have been very, very careful, otherwise you would have been drowned. Because, of course, I still remember that I think I had tears in my eyes. And I did thank him, which I said, Rahmet Tazim, which is the Tartar word, thank you very much. And I took my only one bucket of the water and brought it back to the compound. That I remember very much. So the hard labor section, actually, for all the children, I would say, was very, very difficult. And I have to confess, I was a thief on the top in the compound. And the thievery consisted that during the summertime, I always used to steal the apples, or even winter if there were apples, and bring to the compound so the kids can eat the apples with the bread, which is our main menu of food. One of the things that I would like to explain and expose is the beautiful moments of so-called Christian attitude, if I can use that word, Christian attitude maybe. Because we were children, we were given so-called a lady. She was an elderly lady. She was a Tartar lady. As a matter of fact, I have to confess, for the first time, we actually, children, were trying to be converted into Muslim, because we were even given the orders to use chadra, which was about for 6 years. I did use chadra because the children had to be covered. Now, we were also taken to the mosque. That I remember very, very well. The orthodoxy to which I was born, and Christian, of course, did not exist. But it happens to be that the old woman who was in the compound taking care of us, she was actually, later on I found out from my own mother, who knew her, she was a Muslim Christian. And that's when sort of Christianity, if I can use the word at that time, came into being. And she taught us, in a way, the Muslim Christianity as they do. One of the things I also learned was the Quaresma, which is the 40 days of fasting. It was from that woman who taught us in the prison camp. And I do remember very, very well that in spite of this madness outside that little room that we were all tucked together, she used to talk about the humanity. She used to talk about how to help each other, how to be kind to each other, how not to get angry or how not to lie. But especially, she said, when you will see somebody who is in need. And now that comes back also another thing. She said, even if it will be your last piece of bread that you already ate in something and the other person didn't have, give it to him or to her. People who are sick, people who are old, whenever you see their need to be helped, you should help, no matter what it takes. And I think perhaps whatever humanity that existed in me during those years, and finally when I grew up, it's because of that little moment of few, which is about 4 years or 5 years during those prison attitude. Of course, later on when I came back to Shanghai and all that, has changed. But in the prison camp, I still remember the old woman who took care of us. I do remember that very, very well. Maybe because of her we survived. Maybe because of her we still became human enough to exist and to realize that there is a better world somewhere, and perhaps there's still humanity as a whole has some sort of a right to exist and possible to exist. In order to make us non-human, what they have done, because the war was raging all around, and most of the time during the afternoon, at those times there were no cars, nothing, because only the cows and the horses, the buggy horse or the cow buggies. When the war was raging, the dead people who were the soldiers, they were taken on those by the horses and by the cows' buggies. We were taken into the streets, lined up on the streets, to be shown that this is the dead body of the so-called white Russians who are against the communism, and these are the Belaruski, as they're called, Белобандиты, the white bandits of the Russians. Now you can see them, that they are all killed and they will be buried. We were shown this day in, day out for years and years, and I still sometimes, even in my dreams, I can remember that. And as I did say before, the only respite was the fact that at night somehow, after all that madness of a daily inhuman actions, I would say, by all, we were taken by this old lady who calmed us down before we went to sleep. What they used to do is take out the children from the compound, and when they were to be, some people had to be executed, they will take it into the field. And there were about 12 of us, I remember, 12 children and 12 women and their husbands, because they were all condemned to be executed. In order to show us what is the white bandit or the people who are against the Soviets, they used to take us into the field, and here were the children, and I remember with my dear friend, which is, I think I remember her before Rukuya and then later on. So we came to the field, all the men were put it on sort of, much further to the land. They were stripped off, with exception, it was during the winter, mind, it was during the winter. They were stripped off of everything except the underwears. And women and children, we were paraded to see the execution of these people. And when the soldiers actually, there were 12 of us, so each bullet for each man, they were all executed. I still can remember, and especially for many, many years I used to remember, the awful cry of a woman and the children, and we were stood with Rukoya totally silent, as though it's like the whole world has frozen. But we did not say anything, she and I, because we went through so many times. Other children never seen their parents to be executed. And when everything was over, they left there like piece of dog, dogs being killed, and walked away from that, and we were told to go back to the compounds. And that was very, very often happened. But that execution, I think it's one of the most vivid as long as I live. Another issue is, of course, when I was a child, I have been molested without even knowing what was that all about. And only later on, of course, I realized what happened when I was a child. And
the second time it almost happened that I was persecuted by one of the military men, and it was during the winter, and realizing what happened before, sort of like an instinct, like an animal instinct to get into safety place. So I was crossing, there was a river, and I was crossing the little bridge, but the man was after me very, very fast, so I started to run, and I went under the bridge, and it was during the winter. And of course he lost me, thank God. But under the bridge I managed for about, I think, 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe 20 minutes, I don't know. All that I know that by the time I came out from that cold water and came to the compound, the next day, of course, I got sick. And this is where I got the sort of, my toes were supposed to be amputated because of the frostbite. But somehow the doctor managed to save those. Although later on in the United States, I had to have an operation of the toes. All my bones were totally being sort of demolished, and they had to be taken out. In spite of it, all this beauty, and in spite of the serenity that I have created and tried to create for my mother and my sister when I came to the United States, there are moments of life that flashes come out, and you go back to that. It never ends, trust me. At that time, the survival was the only thing that, again I repeat, like an animal, you try to survive. You forget everything as long as you are still alive, because you've seen so much death. And children do adapt much better than the elderly, I would say. One day, I was in prison, of course, we're still in the compounds. My grandmother came, and she said she bribed actually the officer, later on I found out, to see that he will allow me to go into her compound. That's what, because we were all separated. My sister stayed with my grandmother, thank God. I'm sure she gave something to this old man, or the man who was looking after us. She said, I would like to take my granddaughter just to go to my place because there's a little festivity or something, but I'll bring her back. Of course, I never went there. And when we arrived to her compound, it was getting already night. And grandmother said, now you go and lie down and don't say a word, don't talk to each other, anything, and wait until I'll come and pick you up again. Apparently the old man, the Tartar man, who happened to be in prison camp with my father and my grandfather, he is the one who arranged us to get out from Kuldra into Urumqi. So by midnight, my grandmother comes. It was dark, maybe it was midnight, but it was dark. Grandmama wakes us up, and she said, now don't say a word, be very quiet, don't make any noises. Just put your clothes, whatever we had, one dress, one everything. And a truck came by. And that's where we will put it into the truck, among the potatoes, in the sacks, with the potatoes on the top. We were totally covered. Grandmother managed to sit with the driver in front. And this is at night. We were sneaked out to Urumqi. And that, if it was not that, heaven knows where we would have been today. The trip from Kuldra to Urumqi was 3 nights. And 3 days and 3 nights. So as long as I live, I don't like potatoes, because I always felt the smell of this potato. All what we did during the daytime, we were under this. At night, the cars will stop, so we can go out, a little bit, and then back to the potatoes. So when we arrived to Urumqi, we came actually to my aunt's house. A lady comes up, and that happens to be my aunt Luba, who later on, subsequently, I buried her in Australia, through Philippine Islands to Australia. And when, of course, she saw grandmother, which is her mother, all what I remember, the hugs and the cries, and it went on and on and on. And here I am with my sister, standing on the corner without even being noticed. And of course, we could not understand. My sister spoke Russian, but I didn't. So finally, they even forgot about us, that we existed. So they, Luba, which is Aunt Luba, she took my grandmother and they went inside. And then the boy, I remember, which is Igor, one of my cousins, so he tells in Russian, well, come in. Значит, идите сюда, you know, come in. And so my sister translates to me in Tartar, and she said, Kel, Kuzumka Kel, that's mean, come with me. I mean, I still remember that little episode. So we went inside of the house, and there were other relatives. Of course, they never expected that me and my grandmother will arrive or something. So when they saw grandmother, all the rest of them hugging and crying and everything, and I'm still standing with my sister. And suddenly I look at my sister. She also spoke Tartar. I looked at her and I said, why don't we go out? Let's go outside. This is not ours. And we sneaked away from the room and went back to the gate, outside on the street. And we stood there for about, I think, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes. And it was getting cold and chilly, and we didn't know whether to go inside or to go outside. A woman was coming from the side. And she passed us, and I observed, she looked at us as though we were just two strangers passing by. She went all the way down to the corner, and besides, when you will go down the corner, on the other side was the house where I was born, that I didn't know even, you know, that the house was so close. But when she passed, I remember her coat, the way it was, somehow visual. And I was telling to my sister, I said, you know, in Tartar, Appa means mother. Mother used to have this type of a coat. And my sister said, that's all what she said, because she was 2 years younger than I was. But I said, I remember that coat. And suddenly my mother comes to the corner, stops again, turns around, comes to us, and the first thing she said, Litusik, Litusik. That's how I met mother. We were for 2 or 3 weeks, I think, in my aunt's house. Just before our departure, I saw a dream, maybe it's a childish dream. In the bedroom, there was a window, and the dream showed that as though I opened that little window, and a white dove has descended. And I touched that dove, and somehow I flew away. And it's interesting, when I told about the dream, and then right after that, in the corner there was a big still icon of in my aunt's house, which was very unusual. And that it was Mother Virgin, and somehow I kneeled. This is all in my dreams, that I was kneeling into that, you know, and I felt like somebody was touching my head and said, "Будь такой, как ты сейчас." Always be the way you are today. Never could make sense out of this until maybe later years. And so I told the dream, and I told about the dove to my mother. And she said, I think we will be lucky enough to leave. And then in the afternoon, according to her, because we remember that dream many times with my mother, and she said, in the afternoon, some news came, and they said, be ready for tonight. At night, midnight, we will come and pick you up to take you to the airplane. And at that time, there was an American mission, military mission. My mother used to work there, apparently. So somehow they managed to organize that my mother, myself, only 3 people were able to be taken on their military plane. And we were sneaked out at night, about midnight again, into that military plane and brought into Lanzhou. We arrived to Lanzhou. From Lanzhou, we managed to get to Shanghai. In Shanghai, for the first time, it was a huge city, I remember, and it was beautiful, as a matter of fact, comparing to the prison camps and all this wilderness and so on and so on. Shanghai is the first stop which begins finally, if I can use or can say, a free world. A free world and a free beginning of a free life. Of course, what kind of a life is it, but we still didn't know. But at least there was a freedom that nobody will come at night, knock your door, and take you for the execution. From that point of view, freedom that you can finally go and sleep for the first time in years and years without being known that between 2 and 5, which were their time, will come, and the rest will begin, execution will begin, disappearance will begin. At least that was my memory of the Shanghai entrance. We stayed in the monastery for about almost 2.5 years with Wladyka Shanghaiski, or John. Again, I would say here again begins the new chapter of life, re-education, re-entry, sort of reincarnation of humanity, a reincarnation of that there is still a hope of humanity, because Wladyka Shanghaiski made very, very, clear to all these newcomers, because not only just 2 of us, but many others. Altogether, there were 300 children, most of them without parents. I think we were still lucky that we still had our mother, but majority. And there were about, I understand, 400 boys, something like that. And most of them also didn't have parents. This is the generation, our generation, of what was left from the misery of the Soviet Union invasion and execution and extermination. During those 2.5 years, personally, I would say that it started to become what a humanity means in the behavior, in the belief, in a trust, and at least that there is a future, that's something to look into grow and to grow up as a human being and not as a killer, as I've been telling you before, that I could have been a perfect machine killer. One of the deepest things, of course, I have to say that Christianity in itself, the fate which I had none, because it was all confused, with the exception of the old lady during the prison camps. And Wladyka have spent with us every night. He will come to our monastery where we stayed, or in the house, and he will sit down with us and talk to us as though he was the father of all of us. And of course, in his way, as he did later on, much later, many years later in the Philippine Islands, he will sit and teach us what the Jesus Christ is all about, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which of course we knew nothing. But most of it is behavior toward each other. And there's always one word that comes to me very, very clear. Remember, always remember, no matter what, no matter how hard it is, no matter how awful it is, no matter how destructive it is, never forget that you always have to extend with goodness. Do not ever answer with the same anger, with the same sort of bullets, sort of, action. But whatever it comes, take with grace and be kind toward another person, no matter what, no matter how painful it is, but always answer with kindness. So it's, in a way, it started to return what the old woman used to teach us, to be kind, and when there is a need of help, try to extend. And he also taught, even if you have the last piece of bread, which again goes back to the teaching of the old woman, always give it away. So Wladyka Shanghaiski has done a marvelous job on many, at least on me. If it was not for him, finally, I would not have. Perhaps I would have never been a Christian. Vladika decided that there will be a evening service in the orphanage instead in the church that we usually go on Saturday and Sundays. So when he arrived, although it was just for the girls, the boys was different, there were no boys around, he comes and suddenly does with the little finger showing to me, come here. So I approached him next to the altar and he said, now take this, whatever is in English you call the staff, and just stay here and don't do anything and I'll tell you what to do. And my memory of that is the most fantastic one. I thought to myself immediately, I said, now what am I supposed to do with this stick? Because I didn't know that it was a staff, but it was a stick. And I never had that before in my hands. So I thought, well, what am I supposed to do? And then I asked him, I said, what am I supposed to do with this? He said, you just stay here and I'll tell you what to do. And when I tell you, you do. Okay. So the whole evening of the service, it was almost for 1 hour and 15. I think it was an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half. So there it was. For the first time in my entire life, I stood at the door of the altar with the staff of the Vladika Shanghaiski until he finished. After we finished, he was so clever. He knew how to deal with the children. I have to give him a credit for that. I remember when we finished, he said, now you're going to eat. And there was a food and everything was done. So after the dinner, he said, and now we're going to talk. He was very quiet in his way. So he will gather us together, all the girls, and can you imagine how many? And he will sit around the table and on the floors, on the chair, whatever it was inside. And he will talk for about 2 hours. And this is where begins so-called re-education, re-entry, revival, I would say, from the agnostic into Christianity, if I can use, from the barbarism of behavior into more sublime condition of a behavior, from being totally illiterate in all the Gospels and all the Christian faith into re-entry into the Christian faith. But again, the most important one, I would say, is the human touch, how you have to behave with another human, of which I was totally ignoramus. And yet the other ladies were ladies, and I was still behaving like a tomboy, if there were to be. Anyway, somehow I have to go a little bit back. While we were with that lady, the Tartar lady who taught us many things, at least she gave us, I learned how to sew. Don't ask me how, but I did. And I was a very good stoppelnitsa, as they call it, sew lady. So in the orphanage, every girl, I mean, there were small children, but our age, of course, from 10, 12 onward, each one had its own sort of things to do, and depending what you were able to do, then they will give you that task. And I do remember that I was asked, what can you do? And the first thing came to my mind is sewing, because I was able to do that in the prison camp. I said, well, I know how to sew. And one of the nuns who was there, she said, oh, marvelous, we need somebody because we need good eyes. She said that. And I thought to myself, why would she need the good eyes, not thinking that, meaning that I don't have to use the spectacles or anything. And she comes to me and she says, do you know how to sew the reel? Because Vladika needs a lot of mending. His capuchon, значит, его, and his outfit and everything, but especially that marquisette. It was made out of such a fine silk, not a silk, but marquisette. I even don't know how to translate that. Anyway, so everything that the Vladika needed to be, here it was. It was given to me. That was my task. And many, many nights, when months and everything, and I remember the nun comes, she said, Vladika needs this hat to be mended for tomorrow, and you must do it tonight. It was about 7:30 p.m. or 8 o'clock when it all was happening. No, she came around 6:30, and she said, but Vladika needs it very quickly because he is going to come back for 8 o'clock or 8:30. He has to have this capuchon or the hat that he vestment, with him back to him. So she showed me all that stuff, and I said, okay, fine, I'll do that. And here I started at 6:30 when there was still sort of light, but then by 7:30 it was so dark, and all what we had, a tiny little electric lamp way, way up on the ceiling. And I said, I can't see anymore because it was all black with the black needles. She said, one after another. It was a very difficult task. Anyway, so what I did, I put it on the top of the table, a chair. And I said, and then I'll sit on the chair so I'll be close to the light. Never forget that. So I climbed to the chair, sat on the chair, and here I was bending. And Vladika, in my entire life, since his existence, he never walked. He actually used to fly. That's the best I can. You never can hear when Vladika comes or when Vladika goes. He would come as though it's above the earth, above the earths that you walk on. And out of nowhere, and this happened 100,000,000 times, out of nowhere he will appear. He will just appear. And here I'm sitting mending, and Vladika walks in, of course I was not aware, and he takes his mask and he bangs my head. And all what I remember, I just sort of looked at him and I started to cry. The tears were coming out. And he said the words, "Будь такой, как ты сейчас," meaning be always like this as you are right now. And it's like a carved, So finally he said, and then he looks and he said, "Have you finished the job?" I said, "Almost." He said, "Okay, I'll wait." He sits on the chair while I'm still finishing his bending. And I said, it won't take me too much, but at least I have to finish the last stitches. I finished and I came down. He takes the hat. He takes the one that he had on. He puts on and he said, "Now I'm going to bless you." He blessed me. He said, "Now you go to sleep." Tomorrow was the Sunday that I had to get up 5 o'clock in the morning to go to the Shanghai, to the church. Because at 5 o'clock we will walk for 2 hours to the church, the whole orphanage. And he said, "I'll see you then tomorrow," and that's how I departed on that. Among all the people in the world that I have seen, and I'm especially talking about in the ecclesiastic world, in the church world, in the Christianity as a whole, Vladika Shanghaiski is one of those persons who could see your soul, your heart, your mental stability, your mind, actually. If you will sit with him for a while and he looks at you with this beautiful black, profoundly sort of like piercing eyes, he could read you exactly as a book. And there's no way you could get away with the murder with him. No way. No matter whether you were a child or a grown-up. I even can tell you one of the real story in my own life, like many others, because they were there, we were present. We haven't seen Vladika Shanghaiski for about 20 years after we left to Babao. That was the last time we saw him. Or during the Philippine Islands, he performed miracles, one miracle after another, especially in the Scouts organization. He will come and talk to us for hours and do things that we never even thought that existed. But anyhow, after coming to Washington, D.C., residing here 20 years later, we were told that Vladika Shanghaiski is arriving to Washington. And at that time, we still didn't have our church. We had in the basement, but it's on P Street, not even on the Mass. So St. John the Baptist, St. John on 16th Street already was the church, and at that time was Father Nicholas, who was the headmaster. So when Vladika arrived, of course, there was a service, and you could imagine those who came from Shanghai, Tianjin, and Beijing, like ourselves, everyone flocked into the church. There was no even place, people standing outside. So by the time the church was over and everyone was coming to the kissing of the cross at the end of this, he has remembered all the names of the people who came from Tubabao, who were here. And every time there will come a person to kiss the cross, he will say, Nadezhda, или Piotr, или Paul, или whatever the names, he would remember. My mother and I, and Philip was about three and a half years of age. We were saying, finally, my mother comes in, and the first thing he says to my mother, Verachka, 20 years passed since the day we saw in Tubaba. So when I came, he said, oh, you are my mender who used to mend my clothes. And I said, yes, Vladika, and of course. And again, he looked at me with these huge, these black eyes. He looked at me profoundly. And I looked at him, I said, Vladika, I became much older. He said, yes, you are very old. And then here comes my son, and he looks at my son without asking. He said, oh, and this is your son, Philip. He never saw the child before. And that's how we got the blessing of the last time that we saw him. But his sort of a knowledge of a heart and a soul of a human being, it's impossible to describe. And no matter how bad or how good it is, Vladika always will find the word either reprimand and try you to make sure that it never happens again, or when there's a goodness, he will tell you about that goodness in you. It's just enough to look at him, just enough to see his eyes and his soul. It's like we were sitting an open book, and he can read each one with its own destiny, or each one with its own deed of the past. It's something that will never happen again in this world, during my time at least. The man is gone, the saint was walking on the streets. If one were to ask me for some words of wisdom, they would go like this. Bless this wonderland called America, which offers so much opportunity to those who dream the dreams. Then when you succeed, help others make their dreams come true. Nature, the music of inner life, finds songs and sadness, beauty in devastation, friendship in unexpected places, and love wherever you find it. Have faith in God, for without His wisdom and goodness, the heart cannot endure the tortuous paths of life. Cherish your family, for without it, music and joy of life soon lose their luster. May your children pray you the compliment which Philip recently gave me. My mother is my best friend. She is the star in my heaven. And finally, the words of my mother were right, ring out as clearly today as they did 50 years ago. Never allow yourself to trust so completely that you're not alert to defend the freedom, our most prized possession. And to conclude with this, I would like again to bring back to the words of Vladika Shanghaiski. He said, no matter how ill and no matter how heartful and less heartful and how awful and at times dangerous that you might be offended, never give up to pay the sadness of their bad deeds with the goodness. Never abandon that. Never go to the extreme of paying back with the hurt that they have caused you with the same hurt or worse. And because if you will go through that, you will see that the moment you realize that hardship that they impose on your soul and your heart and your mind and everything
for any type of accusation or of any type of deeds which are very, very, very dark, if you will go away and just remember that if Jesus Christ have died on his crucifixion the way he did, it's because we, the people, have offended him. And yet, as he is the Jesus, and as well as Father Ian Shanghaiski said, if you will take it away that and forgive thy neighbor who has wronged you so deeply, you will simply feel the elevation of your own self, not your body, but your soul, which goes sort of instead of a darkness, into the light of existence. And I think if people cannot only feel once in their life that existence, which I have to say that I have felt many, many times, that beautiful serenity within your soul, your mind, your whole body, and suddenly you see, instead of this shameful, devilish sort of imprisonment of your soul, you let it go and defend yourself with goodness against the evil. I think you will feel much better, and the elevation is absolutely divine that I cannot explain to you. And I only wish that each person will go through that. And always remember, no matter what it is, no matter how much money you have, no matter what prestigious you might have in this world, unless you believe and unless you have a soul of goodness and a soul of Christian faith and of Christian deeds, the rest in the world means nothing.